Hello and welcome to the next edition of the BriefingsDirect Voice of Innovation podcast series. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host and moderator for this ongoing discussion on IT, infrastructure, automation, and efficiency. Like many retailers, REI was faced with drastic and rapid change when the COVID-19 pandemic struck. REI's marketing leaders wanted to make sure that their online e-commerce capabilities would rise to the challenge. They expected a nearly overnight 150% jump in REI's purely digital business. Fortunately, REI's IT leadership had already advanced their systems to heightened automation, which allowed the Seattle-based merchandiser to turn on a dime and devote much more of its private cloud to the new e-commerce workload demands. Stay with us here and now as we learn how REI kept its digital customers and business leadership happy, even as the world around them was suddenly shifting. To explore what works for making IT agile and responsive enough to refactor a private cloud at breakneck speed, we're joined by Brian Sullins, Senior Cloud Systems Engineer at REI in Seattle. Welcome to BriefingsDirect, Brian.
Thanks, Dana. I appreciate it. I am happy to be here.
You know, when the pandemic required you to sort of hop to, how did REI manage to have the IT infrastructure to actually move at the true pace of business? What put you in a position to be able to act as you did?
So just a little background information on that as a result of the stay-at-home orders, and this was as of a couple of months ago. We have a pretty large sale in the middle of May. It's our largest sale of the year. It's called our anniversary sale. And ramping up to that, our marketing and sales department had realized that we have a huge uptick in sales. People really wanted to get outside, right? Because going outdoors allows for people to get outside without breaking any of the, kind of stay-at-home orders. Mm-hmm. One of the things they noticed, for example, is that bike sales were up 310% compared to that time last year. So ramping up to that, we kind of anticipated that we would need to ramp up our online presence, REI.com. And the goal was to really do it up to 200% just to kind of make up for it. I mean, we anticipate 150%, but we wanted to scale up by 200%. And in order to do that, we had to reallocate a bunch of ESXi hosts in vSphere that we either had to stand up as new or we had to reallocate from other clusters in the organization and put them into what we call our digital retail presence. What we were able to do with that as a result of our fully automated process, which we're using OneView, Synergy, and ImageStreamer for that, we were able to reallocate 6 out of the 17 total hosts that we had to reallocate. We were able to do that in 18 minutes all at once. And that's single touch. That's launching the automation and then pulling them from one cluster and decomming them and placing them all the way into the digital retail clusters. We also had some that are on what we would call our legacy platform. They're not on Synergy yet, and those took the rest of the, an additional 3 days on top of that, right, for those. But again, those are in transition. We're moving to that fully automated platform all around.
Yeah, that's amazing because just a few years ago, that sort of transition would have been unheard of. And even if you were able to do it slowly, as was the custom, you weren't always guaranteed that you'd have the performance and the full operations that you wanted. Let me ask you, if you were not able to do this, if this pandemic had hit, heaven forbid, 5 or 7 years ago, what might have been the outcome?
There were twofold outcomes with this. The first is sort of the fairly obvious issue with the not being able to handle the traffic. And that manifests itself in lots of different ways on our REI.com presence, right? It could be people aren't able to put stuff into a shopping cart, inventory doesn't decrement, and so on, right? So it could be a very broad range of things. So we needed to make sure that we had the infrastructure capacity so that none of that stuff falls over under a heavy load. So that was kind of the first part of that.
When you have people in the heat of a purchasing moment, if you're not there and it's not working, they have other options. And not only do you lose that sale, you might lose that customer and your brand suffers as well.
Oh, without a doubt. And then the other issue, of course, would be that not meeting the deadlines. We had just under a week to get this accomplished. And if we had to do this without doing the full automation approach, we may have had to return to our managers and say, yeah, so we can't do it that quickly. But with our approach, we are able to do that within the time frame and be able to get some sleep in the interim. So it's a win-win.
So digital transformation pays off after all.
Without a doubt.
Before we learn more about your journey to automation, tell us a bit about REI. You're investments in automation and why you consider yourself a data-driven digital business.
Well, the long story is that, and a lot of what I'm about to say, precedes me quite a bit, but I would say going back to the early 2000s, based on what my managers tell me and tell us, there was this huge push to become an IT organization that just so happens to do retail. The priority is on IT being the driving force behind everything we do. And that is something that at the time, REI really needed to do because there are other competitors, much of which we won't name, but you probably know who they are. REI needed to stay ahead of that curve. So since then, there have been constant sweeping and cyclical changes for that digital transformation. The most recent one really is this push for automating all the things. So that's the priority that we have, and that's kind of our marching orders.
In addition to your company, your culture, and your technology, tell us about yourself, Brian. What is it about your background and personal development that led you to be in a position to act so forthrightly and swiftly?
So I got my start in IT back in '99. I was a public school teacher before that, and I made the transition to doing IT training. And I did IT training from '99 to about 2012. And during those years, I got a lot of certs because in the IT training world, you have to. And, I started with what was then at the time called the MCSE. And then I also did the LPI, the Linux Professional Institute, before it was a thing. I got that certification. And I really glommed onto Linux, kind of wanted to set myself apart from the rest of the field. So I went all in on Linux. And then 2008, 2009-ish, I jumped on the VMware train, went all in on VMware. And I was a VCI for quite some time. I actually did the official VMware curriculum, taught that for about 3 years. And then 2012, just kind of try to keep this story a bit short. 2012, I made the transition from IT training into actually doing this for realties as an engineer working at Dell. And at the time, Dell had, maybe still has, a infrastructure as a service healthcare cloud, which is fairly large. It's 1,200 plus ESXi hosts. We were also responsible for the storage side, so we were responsible for the 90 plus SAN arrays as well. And in an environment that large, you really have to automate. And I kind of cut my teeth on automating through PowerCLI and Ansible at the time. This is kind of turning the corner of 2014, 2015. And it's just been a focus of my career since. I'm not saying I'm a guru at it by any means, but it's been a focus of my career. And then in 2018, REI came calling, and I jumped on that opportunity because they're a super awesome company. And right off the bat, I got kind of free reign over, hey, if you want to automate it, then you automate it. And I have been doing that ever since. And that was August of 2018. I've been there ever since.
What briefly helped you making that transition from training to cloud engineer? Did it give you a forward-looking sense of what to expect and to not wait? Some people like to wait and see before they jump into new technologies. Was that not your philosophy?
I typically jump right into new technologies. I don't know if that comes from the training or if that's just me as a person, but yeah, I typically jump right on it. And just kind of related, and I'm not sure this answers the question per se, but one of the positives that I've gotten from the training world is that in the training world, you learn 100% of the feature base that's available with said technology. And I was able to take what I learned and what I knew from VMware and then say, okay, well, now I have the real world experience to back that up as well. So yeah, it was a good transition.
Let's look at this now as how organizations can learn and anticipate the shift to automation. What are some of the challenges that organizations typically face when it comes to being agile in their infrastructure? Why does automation need to happen?
The challenges that I've seen aren't usually technical. Usually the technologies that people use to automate things are ready at hand, and many of which are free. Ansible, for example, is free. PowerCLI, it's free. Jenkins is free, right? These are all things that, well, I shouldn't say free because nothing's free. Let's say that. But as far as
free like a puppy, right?
Yeah, exactly. So being able to do those things are things that people can start doing tomorrow. And I think, at the risk of stating the obvious, the real challenge is changing people's mindsets about this more automated approach. I think that it's tough to overcome what I call the provisioning by council. because a more traditional sort of on-prem, quote unquote, private cloud, or I should say on-prem approach is, okay, we have some applications owners who they want to roll out this application. It needs X number of VMs. It needs all these particular specs and whatnot. And then a council of people typically look that over and kind of scratch their chin and say, okay, we approve. And now we've got to scale up before we can do that. And it becomes this sort of gatekeeping process, right? So with a more automated approach, and one of the other examples that we have at REI is we're using a cloud management platform to automate processes. We're using that to do our self-service VMs, just as an example of what kinds of things you can run into. So instead of having this rollout by council where some of these VMs can take days or weeks to roll out because you have a lot of human beings touching it along the way, we have a lot of that process kind of pre-approved. Everybody said, okay, we're okay with if you roll out a VM or X number of VMs, we're okay with the way it's done. And then we can roll that out in 7 to 10 minutes rather than having a ticket-based sort of thing where somebody gets to it when they can. Here, self-service, they are able to do that. And that takes a pretty big shift in psychology sometimes. A lot of people are used to being the gatekeeper, and it can make them uncomfortable. Fortunately for me, a lot of the people at REI are on board with this sort of approach. But I think that can be something that a lot of people can run into.
Yeah, you can't just buy automation on a box off a shelf, right? I mean, if you've got a whole accumulation of manual processes that have been piling up, you have to deal with them as well as institute the products. So tell us a little bit about why the manual processes is a big thing to overcome as well.
I try to describe it as a private cloud because the challenge that we have is that there's a healthy level of competition between what's going in the public cloud and what we do in the data center. The public cloud team has the capability of, quote unquote, selling their solution in side by side with ours. And if you have applications owners who are technically adept, and pretty much all of them are at REI, they can be tempted to say, well, I don't want to wait a week to 2 weeks to get a VM. I want to create one right now out on the public cloud. That's a big challenge for us. And what we're trying to accomplish, and we've had some success so far, it's in a state of transition, is have some Venn diagram of feature base that we can offer to our applications owners, which we would call our customers, really, right? The shareholders who are consuming what we have. This allows for them to have the flexibility of, okay, yeah, I have this application I want to run in the public cloud, but I can't based on the needs for that application. We have to run it on-prem. And if we need to run it on-prem, then they can do that in an automated way. And I think that's a big win. And that's kind of what people expect now, quite honestly.
Yeah, they want the look and feel of a public cloud, but all the benefits of the private cloud. It's up to you to provide that. Let's find out how you did. How did you overcome the challenges that we've talked about, and what are the investments that you made in tools, platforms, ecosystem of players that accomplished it?
The players that we use, well, first of all, like I mentioned previously, we have a lot of our utilities that are quote unquote free, right? The Ansibles of the world, the Power CLI and whatnot. We talked about the use of Morpheus to do our self-service, and the implication behind automating things on what I would call the front end, right? The customer facing side. The issue that you have there is you don't get that control of scaling up before you provision the VMs. You have to monitor and then roll out on the back end, right? So you have to monitor for usage and then scale up on what I would call the back end, and kind of seamlessly. The end users aren't supposed to know that you're scaling up. They're not. I don't want them to know. It's not their job to know. I want to remain out of their way. So in order to do that, what we've built is a combination of technologies. Ansible, HPE actually has a GitHub link for a lot of Ansible playbooks that plug right into OneView. I'm assuming that's going to be in the show notes for this. And then the underlying sort of hardware adjacent management ecosystem platform is OneView with Synergy and ImageStreamer. And with a combination of all of those technologies, we were able to accomplish that 18-minute rollout of our various ESXi hosts.
So even though you have an integrated platform and solutions approach, it sounds to me like you've also made the leap from ushering pets through the process into herding cattle. If you understand my metaphor, what has allowed you to stop treating each and every instance as a pet into being able to just herd this stuff through on an automated basis and turn on a dime at scale?
There is a psychological challenge with that. Let's say that, in that the quote unquote more traditional approach is, and the VMware listeners are going to be very well aware of this. A more traditional approach is, okay, I need to have a 4-node cluster with this number of CPUs, this amount of RAM, and so on. And that 4-node cluster is static. Yes, if I need to add a fifth down the line, I can do that. But that 4-node cluster, that's its home, sometimes for the entire life cycle of that particular host. With the approach that we're doing, although we do have some visions for the future for it, but the approach that we're doing is we're treating our ESXi hosts as cattle. And the OneView Synergy image streamer technology has allowed for us to be able to do that in conjunction with those tools we mentioned previously, Ansible in particular. So rather than, we have this cluster and it's static and it stays that way, it might even have a naming convention that indicates what cluster it's in and where it is. In reality, we have cattle-based DNS names for our ESXi hosts. And at any time, the understanding throughout the organization, or at least for the people who need to know, at any time, any host can be pulled from one cluster automatically and placed into another, particularly when it comes to resource usage on that cluster. And my dream, ultimately, I know I may be getting a little bit ahead of the conversation, but my dream is that the robots will do this automatically while I sleep. So you have a cluster that becomes in the yellow, goes into the yellow with its capacity usage based on a threshold. The robot can interpret that and say, I've got another cluster over here with a host that is underutilized. I'm going to decom it, pull it into the cluster that's in the yellow, and then bring it back down into the green again, all while we sleep. And then we wake up in the morning and hey, look at that. The robots move that over.
Algorithmic operations. It sounds very exciting.
Yes, we have the push button automation in place for that. It's
right.
Going to the next level of what engine is going to make that decision and do all those things.
Right. And that raises another issue is when you take that plunge into automation, you're making your way down the Chisholm Trail with your cattle, all of a sudden it becomes easier along the way. The automation begets more automation. So tell me why, when you start automating that, you learn and you grow and it becomes more automated along the way.
Yeah, and if I may, just kind of to put an exclamation point on this topic, imagine the situation that we opened the show with, which is, okay, hey, we've got to reallocate a bunch of hosts for REI.com. If it's fully automated and we have robots that are making those decisions, the response is instantaneous. Hey, we want to scale up by 200% on REI.com. We can say, okay, well then go ahead, roll out your VMs. The system will react accordingly. It will add physical hosts as you see fit, and we don't have to do anything. We've already done the work with the automation. But to the automation begetting automation, which is a great way of putting it, by the way, when I typically, and this happened at Dell, and this is also at REI, there's always opportunities for automation. And just kind of on a career side note, I want to dispel this whole myth that you automate your way out of a job. That is a complete and total myth. I'm not saying it doesn't happen where people get laid off as a result of automation. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. That's relatively rare, because when you automate something, first of all, that automation is going to need to be maintained because things change over time. But the other piece to that is a lot of times you have different organizations who are at various states of automation. And once you kind of get your head above water to where it's like, okay, we have this process and now it's become trivial because it's been automated away, we can now concentrate on automating more, for either more things, or you have new things that need to be automated. And whether that's the process for rolling out VMs, whether that's a new feature base, whether that's monitoring, whether that's auto scaling, whatever it is, you have the capability of, from day one, automating those processes.
What was it specifically about the HPE, OneView, and Synergy that allowed you to move past the manual processes and the firefighting and the accumulation of process into this more herding cattle and being progressively automated?
Specifically, it was two things. The image streamer was number one. To date, we don't run Pixie Boot infrastructure. Not that we can't, it's just not something that we've traditionally done. So we needed a more standard process for doing that. And ImageStreamer fit that to where it solved that problem. And then the second piece to that is the provided Ansible playbooks that HPE has to kick off that entire process. So if you're somewhat versed in how HPE does things through OneView, you have a server profile that you can impose on a blade that can be fully automated through Ansible. And by the way, I should mention, HPE will enjoy the fact that I'm mentioning this. You don't have to use ImageStreamer to use that Ansible automation. You can. This is really more of a OneView approach where you can actually use it to do automated profiles and whatnot. But the ImageStreamer is really what allows for us to say, okay, we build a gold image. We can apply that gold image to any frame in the cluster. That's the first part to it. The rest of it is just really configuring the ESXi host.
So it sounds, Brian, like the HPE composable infrastructure approach works well with others, that you're able to have it your way, if you will, because you like Ansible and you've got a history of certain products and you have skills that are inherent in your organization. Do you feel that that's the case, that this is that the HPE composable infrastructure fits into an ecosystem, but that it's flexible enough to take in and integrate with a variety of different approaches and partners?
Well, it has been so far. We've anticipated the possibility of leveraging HPE for our Linux infrastructure, our bare metal Linux infrastructure. One of the additional driving forces, or one of the big initiatives right now, is Kubernetes. We are going all in on Kubernetes in our private cloud as well. And some of our worker nodes, we eventually plan on running those as bare metal. And the HPE OneView, even with the ImageStreamer, also is something that we can leverage for that as well. So the flexibility, absolutely, yes.
And it's interesting. You've been there. You've seen the transition from having VMware and other hypervisor sprawl, and then finding a way to manage, and then even go further and automate. Do you see the same thing playing out for containers? And what's the powerful end game when we are able to automate containers?
So far, we've been utilizing Rancher as part of our coordination tool for our Kubernetes infrastructure, and utilizing vSphere currently 6.7 for that. So we're using that. As far as the containerization approach, REI has been doing containers before containers were a thing. Our containerization platform has been around since, I want to say, 2014, at least 2015. So, REI has been pretty cutting edge,
right,
as far as that is concerned. And we're looking now that kind of Kubernetes has won the orchestration wars, as it were. Mm-hmm. We're looking to standardize that for people who want to do things online, which is to say, kind of going back to the digital transformation journey, as it were. Now that the industry has caught up with what our super awesome devs have done with containerization, a lot of what we're looking to do with that transition is get a lot of the heavy lifting of maintaining the platform away from the devs, now that we have a standard approach with Kubernetes, so they don't have to worry so much about it, to where they can just develop what they need to develop.
As you look at your automation journey, I wonder in hindsight if you've developed any sort of a philosophy or lessons learned about making the transition to automation. As I say, you've seen it happen in the virtualization world, you've seen it happening in private cloud, and you've seen it in composable infrastructure as well. What's your philosophy about how this should work in the future?
Have you read the Unicorn Project yet?
I've heard of it.
Yeah. Well, there's the Phoenix Project and there's the Unicorn Project, and it's pretty hyped, we'll call it, set of books. And one of the, without spoiling too much of it, my take from that is this whole idea of trust, of trusting other people. I see that quite a bit in multiple organizations. Again, REI is, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's been very good about, okay, we're going to work on this as a team and we trust each other and so on. So we have a pretty good culture, but I would imagine that in some places that is a pretty big challenge. And if you take a look at the Unicorn Project, a lot of the issues that they have to do with trusting other human beings. Something happened, somebody made a mistake and it caused an outage, so they lock it up and lock it away and say only certain people can do that. And then if you multiply that times, that happening multiple times, and then different individuals locking that down, it leads to not being able to automate those processes and allow for it to happen in the background without somebody approving it.
I can't imagine you would have been able to do what you did back when you had to transition your private cloud for more online activity if you didn't have that trust built into your culture.
Yeah, and the big, I would say that the big challenge that might come up is this whole idea of trusting your end users. I mean, once you go into the realm of self-service, you come up with typical what ifs. Well, what if somebody adds a 0 and they meant to roll out 4 VMs and they roll out 40, right? That's possible. So, how do you create guardrails that are seamless to that, but then also realize that if you trust your users, then that won't happen, or you decrease the risk that will happen, or you have to kind of have that leap of faith.
We're coming up on the end of our time. I was going to try to ask you a little bit about your wish list of what comes next. What would you like HPE to be doing? Tell us a little bit about what you expect to be able to do in 2 years.
One thing on the topic of kind of my approach, and that is as far as starting to do automation, start with one thing and work up from there. Right? You don't have to use a buzzword. You don't have to boil the ocean, right? Start with something small and work your way up. But as far as the next steps with what we're doing, I mentioned the auto scaling at the physical layer, right? And having the robots do all of that. The robots will scale up and down our clusters while we sleep. One of the things that we have been doing and will continue to do is API capable automation, which is to say that we want to be able to, and we found that the API capable automation with anything that has an API REST or otherwise, if we can connect to that and manipulate it, we can do pretty much whatever automation we want. So there's that. We're going to be doing, outside of automating all the things, we're also containerizing all the things. So if any application can be containerized properly, then the driving sort of, or the initiative for that is to containerize it if you can. As far as what decision-making engine we have to do the auto-scaling of the physical layer, we haven't really decided upon what that is. We have some ideas, but we're still looking for that.
How about predictive analytics, using more AI with the data that you have emanating from your data center, maybe AI ops? Anything come to mind in terms of where you'd like that to go?
Without a doubt. I mean, I, for one, haven't really done any sort of deep dives into that. I know that's all the rage right now, but I would be open to pretty much anything that will accomplish what I just talked about. If that's InfoSight, then that's what it is. I don't have a lot of experience, quite honestly, with InfoSight as of yet. We do have it installed in kind of a POC form, although a lot of the priorities for that have been shifted due to the COVID-19 stuff going on currently. We hope to revisit that pretty soon, so absolutely.
Mm-hmm. All right. To close out, we heard about the challenges you had. You transitioned your organization. You were ahead of the curve a bit on digital transformation. That allowed you to be very agile when it came time to react to the COVID-19 pandemic and the different shifts in buying behavior. What did that get you? Do you have any result? Were you able to keep up with your sales? And did you fulfill the mission that your leadership and your business wanted?
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, our boss's boss is boss. So 3 bosses up for me, right? He actually sits in on both our load testing, because we do load testing up right before the actual sale occurs. And then, it's kind of an all hands on deck situation during that sale. And he said that it was the most seamless one that he'd ever seen. There were almost no issues with this one. What I attribute that to is, yes, what we had done on the infrastructure side to make sure that we met that need, but also everybody worked as a team, man. Everybody all the way on up the stack, from our contribution, the hypervisor and the hardware layer, all the way on up to the application layer and the containers and all of our DevOps stuff. It was very successful. And we went past our goals of what we had thought for that sale. So it was a win-win all the way around.
Terrific, even though you were going through this terrible period of adjustment. So that's very impressive. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. We've been exploring how REI faced drastic and rapid IT demand shifts when the COVID-19 pandemic struck. And we've learned how an embrace of digital business transformation, highly automated systems operations, and a modern ecosystem of platforms and advanced technology solutions save the day. So please join me in thanking our guest. We've been here with Brian Sullins, Senior Cloud Systems Engineer at REI. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Dana. And shameless plug, if I may.
Please.
My personal blog is thinkingoutcloud.org, and I encourage people to go there because the how-to on how we accomplished much of what we talked about here, I have blog posts for that. And then you can contact me at Russian Lit Guy on Twitter.
Very good. Also, we'll take the opportunity to thank our audience for joining us for this sponsored BriefingsDirect Voice of Innovation discussion. Please take a look at Brian's blog, learn more about making the transition to an agile private cloud infrastructure. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host for this ongoing series of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise supported discussions. Thanks again for listening. Please pass this along to your IT community and do come back next time.